On the morning of October 18th, 1874, a deputy clerk named Martin Ashby arrived at the Albemarle County Records Office to find the door ajar and the smell of rain drifting through a broken window. It was not yet 6 o'clock. He would later testify that he called out twice, received no answer, and then stepped inside to discover Abigail Whitmore lying face down on the floor of the registry room, her left hand still clutching a torn page from a property ledger. Her hair had come loose from its pins. A wooden chair lay overturned near the window. The door to the room, he noted, had been bolted from the inside. The deputy clerk ran to fetch the sheriff. By the time Nathaniel Crowe arrived, a small crowd had gathered on the wooden sidewalk outside the office, drawn by the commotion. They watched as two men carried Abigail out on a stretcher, her eyes half open, but seeing nothing. She was 32 years old, a widow, and had worked as a copyist for the county for nearly 6 years. No one in the crowd could name a single person who wished her harm. The initial report filed by Sheriff Crowe described the incident as an interrupted burglary. According to his account, an unknown intruder had entered through the front door of the records office sometime after midnight, intending to steal whatever money or valuables might be kept on the premises. The intruder was surprised by Abigail Whitmore, who had apparently returned to the office late to finish copying a set of deeds. A struggle ensued. The intruder struck her, fled through the window, and escaped into the darkness before anyone could raise an alarm. The explanation was tidy, reasonable, and almost entirely contradicted by the physical evidence. The front door, examined by 2 separate deputies, showed no signs of forced entry. The lock was intact. The bolt on the inner door of the registry room had been slid into place from inside, meaning that whoever attacked Abigail had either locked himself in with her or had locked the door behind him after leaving through the window that faced the alley. The window itself was shattered, but the glass fragments lay mostly outside on the packed earth, suggesting the break had come from within. A cash box kept in the lower drawer of the head clerk's desk remained untouched and still contained $47 in coin and paper currency. A silver letter opener, a brass inkstand, and a pocket watch belonging to the absent clerk were all found in their usual places. Nothing of obvious monetary value had been taken. The only things missing were pages from a single ledger, the bound record of property transfers filed between the spring of 1865 and the autumn of 1867. Dozens of pages had been torn out, some cleanly at the binding, others ripped with such force that fragments of paper still clung to the stitches. No other books had been disturbed. Abigail Whitmore regained consciousness at the county infirmary shortly before noon that same day. Dr. Lyman Greeley, who attended her, noted in his report that she presented with bruising along the left side of her jaw, a shallow laceration above her right eyebrow, and persistent disorientation. She could answer simple questions, but became agitated when asked to describe her attacker. Her hands trembled whenever she attempted to speak of what she had seen. She recalled the smell of damp wool and tobacco. She recalled a voice near her ear, low and measured, telling her to forget the names she had read. And she recalled, with strange and unsettling clarity, the sound of a cane striking the floorboards 3 times. Tap, tap, tap. On the subject of the attacker's face, however, her memory offered nothing at all. It was as if the figure in her recollection had no features worth describing, or as if some part of her mind had simply refused to record them. Sheriff Crowe interviewed her twice. The first interview, conducted at the infirmary on the afternoon of the 18th, lasted approximately 20 minutes and produced no useful information. The second, held at Abigail's rented room on Market Street 3 days later, was even shorter. By then, Crowe had already filed his preliminary conclusion. The case, he informed the county commissioners, was a simple matter of a vagrant surprised in the middle of a petty theft. The torn ledger pages were an unfortunate act of vandalism, nothing more. He recommended no further investigation. The matter might have ended there, buried in the shallow grave of administrative convenience, were it not for the envelopes. They began arriving at Abigail Whitmore's lodging 4 days after she was released from the infirmary. The first appeared on the morning of October 23rd, slipped under her door sometime before dawn. It was a plain envelope, unaddressed, unsealed, containing a single sheet of paper. The sheet was blank. When Abigail held it up to the window, she saw nothing. When she turned it toward the lamplight, she saw nothing. It was only when she tilted the page at a sharp angle against the morning glare that the marks became visible, faint indentations, grooves pressed into the fibers by a hand that had written something on a sheet placed directly above it, a sheet that had since been removed. She did not know what to make of it. She placed the envelope in the drawer of her nightstand and tried to forget it. The following week, a second envelope arrived, identical to the first, then a third. By the middle of November, she had received 11 of them, each containing a blank sheet that, under the right light, betrayed the ghost of writing that was no longer there. It was Elias Bell who first understood what the marks might mean. Bell was 40 years old in 1874, a lean, prematurely grey man who operated a small printing press on Water Street and published a modest weekly newspaper called the Albemarle Observer. He had come to the region after the war, having spent his youth as a typesetter in Richmond before deciding that he preferred the quiet rhythms of a town where the biggest story of the month was usually the price of tobacco at the autumn market. He had known Abigail Whitmore casually for several years. She sometimes brought him notices from the courthouse for publication, and he occasionally set aside copies of old deed filings that she needed for her copying work. When she appeared at his shop on the morning of November 19th, holding a sheaf of blank pages and looking as though she had not slept in days, he listened. She spread the pages across his workbench and showed him how, when the light struck them from the side, patterns emerged. Letters, numbers, fragments of names. Bell, who had spent decades arranging type and reading impressions reversed on paper, recognized the technique. Someone had used these sheets as backing paper, writing on a page placed above them so that the pressure of the pen left grooves in the sheet below. Then the top sheet had been removed, leaving only the impression behind. It was a crude method, but effective. The marks could not be read under normal circumstances, but they could not be erased either. Bell retrieved a soft graphite pencil from his drawer and gently rubbed it across the surface of the first page. The graphite caught in the indentations, darkening the grooves while leaving the surrounding paper clean. Words began to appear. They were incomplete in places. Some impressions were too light, others had been smeared or overlaid, but the general shape of the original writing became visible. The fragments that emerged were property descriptions, lot numbers, coordinates referenced against county survey lines, and names of men who had once owned land in Albemarle County during the years immediately following the collapse of the Confederacy. Abigail recognized some of them. They were the names she had been copying on the night of the attack, pulled from a ledger that no longer existed, the ledger from which someone had torn dozens of pages. Someone had used those torn pages as a template, copying the list onto new sheets with these blank pages beneath them, then sent the blanks to her as a kind of warning, or perhaps as evidence of something they could not bring themselves to destroy. The first fully legible name that emerged from the pages was Josiah Crane. According to county records, Crane had owned a modest farm of 80 acres near the Rivanna River, worked primarily by himself and his 2 sons. He had enlisted in the Confederate Army in 1862 and had not returned after the surrender at Appomattox. His property had been confiscated under the wartime provisions, sold at public auction in the spring of 1865, and purchased by a consortium of local investors for the sum of $212. The deed transfer bore the signature of Silas Pembroke, the county notary for whom Abigail had worked as a copyist for the past 6 years. That fact alone might not have troubled her. Pembroke was the notary. His signature appeared on thousands of documents. What troubled her was a small notation she had noticed in the margin of the original deed 2 weeks before the attack, during a routine cross-check of property records requested by a lawyer from Richmond. The notation, written in Pembroke's own hand, indicated that Josiah Crane had been declared dead in absentia by a circuit judge in May of 1865. But in a later volume, in a record of a land dispute from 1867, Abigail had found a sworn statement filed by Crane's younger son, Benjamin, claiming that his father had returned to the farm in February of 1866, alive and in apparent good health, only to disappear again 3 weeks later after a meeting with unnamed parties at the courthouse. She had made a note of the discrepancy. She had not mentioned it to anyone. She had simply written the reference numbers in her personal notebook, intending to bring it to Pembroke's attention when he returned from a trip to Lynchburg. That notebook was one of the few things that had been taken from her on the night of the attack. It had been in the pocket of her dress when she was found unconscious. When she woke at the infirmary, it was gone. Josiah Crane was not the only name on the list. As Bell continued to work the graphite across the pages, other names surfaced. Thomas Granger, a wheelwright who had inherited 30 acres from his uncle in 1864 and vanished the following spring. Elijah Mosby, a tenant farmer who had filed a claim for ownership of a parcel he had worked for 15 years, only to withdraw the claim abruptly and leave the county 2 weeks later. Nathan Cole, a veteran who had returned from the war to find his family's homestead occupied by strangers and who, according to a court filing, had been declared mentally incompetent by a doctor named Amos Whitley before being removed to a state facility from which no further records emerged. The properties that had once belonged to these men had all been transferred between 1865 and 1867. The purchasers in every case were the same small group of names. Silas Pembroke had notarized every single transfer. Bell and Abigail began to work in the evenings after the print shop closed and the streets of Charlottesville fell quiet. Bell had access to decades of newspaper archives, including editions of papers from neighboring counties that had long since ceased publication. He began searching for any mention of the names on the list. What he found over the following weeks was a pattern that seemed at first merely coincidental, and then, as the evidence accumulated, increasingly difficult to explain. In the classified sections of old newspapers, tucked between advertisements for farm equipment and notices of estate sales, there appeared a series of small, identically worded inquiries. They asked for information about men who had returned from the war and then, without explanation, left their homes and families. One such notice, printed in the Charlottesville Chronicle in March of 1866, read, "Information sought regarding Nathan Cole, late of Albemarle County, last seen near the Rivanna crossing on the 12th of February. Any person with knowledge of his whereabouts is requested to contact the undersigned." The notices were signed by different names, sometimes a relative, sometimes a former employer, occasionally a lawyer acting on behalf of an estate. But Bell noticed something that the casual reader might have overlooked. The language in each notice was nearly identical. The phrasing, the punctuation, even the abbreviation of dates followed the same pattern. It was as though they had all been written by the same hand. More disturbing were the letters that followed some of these inquiries. In several cases, the newspapers had printed responses from the missing men themselves, or from individuals claiming to represent them. One such letter, purportedly written by Thomas Granger and published in the Lynchburg Register in August of 1866, stated that he had departed willingly for the Western Territories and had no intention of returning. Another, attributed to Elijah Mosby, informed his former neighbors that he had found work in Missouri. A third, supposedly dictated by Josiah Crane from a hospital in Tennessee, explained that he had been injured and could no longer manage his farm, and that he relinquished all claims to the property. The letters were brief, courteous, and utterly convincing, except for one detail that Bell spotted while comparing them side by side on his workbench. In every letter, the word received was spelled with the I before the E. Received. Oh, the same misspelling appeared in the notarization Silas Pembroke attached to the property transfers. It was a small thing, a single inverted pair of letters, but it appeared in documents supposedly written by 5 different men, none of whom had any known connection to one another, except that their land had been purchased by the same group of investors. By the first week of December, Abigail had recovered sufficiently to return to her work at the courthouse, though she moved more slowly than before and startled at unexpected sounds. Pembroke received her with professional courtesy, expressing relief at her recovery and concern over the ordeal she had endured. He offered no comment on the missing pages from the ledger, explaining that the book had been misfiled during the confusion and would likely turn up in time. When Abigail mentioned that she had been unable to locate several property records she had been cross-referencing before the attack, Pembroke suggested that her memory might still be affected by the blow to her head. He recommended rest. He offered to reduce her workload. He was, by every outward measure, a considerate and solicitous employer. Abigail said nothing to him about the envelopes, or about Elias Bell, or about the graphite impressions slowly resolving into a ledger of the disappeared. She continued to perform her duties during the day, copying deeds and filing certificates with the same steady hand she had always possessed, while in the evening she sat at the small table in her rented room, arranging the recovered fragments into something approaching a coherent record. She worked by candlelight, the blank pages spread before her like a deck of cards dealt by an invisible player. The names accumulated, the lot numbers resolved into parcels of land, the dates aligned with a period of chaos and opportunity that had followed the war, when records were scattered, witnesses were dead or displaced, and a man with access to the county archives could rewrite entire histories with no one to challenge him. It was during this period of quiet reconstruction that Abigail's memory began to return. Not all at once, but in fragments that surfaced unpredictably, like debris rising from a flooded river. She would be copying a deed and suddenly recall the smell of kerosene and old wood. She would be walking home along Market Street and hear in her mind the echo of 3 sharp taps. The details arrived without context, disconnected images that she collected and examined like pieces of a broken plate. A dark hallway, a door that opened before she knocked, the glint of metal on the tip of a cane, a voice she recognized but could not place, whispering close to her ear in a tone that was almost gentle. The breakthrough came on the night of December 11th, when she woke from a dream with the full recollection of how she had come to be at the records office on the evening of the attack. She had not returned to the office of her own accord. She had been summoned. A note had been delivered to her lodging earlier that afternoon, written on courthouse stationery and bearing the signature of Silas Pembroke. The note had instructed her to come to the registry room at 9 o'clock that evening to assist with an urgent filing matter. She had recognized Pembroke's handwriting and had thought nothing of the request. He often worked late and occasionally called on her for additional copying duties. She had dressed, walked the 6 blocks to the courthouse, and found the front door unlocked. The registry room door had been partially open. She had stepped inside, and then the light had gone out. She told Bell about the note the following morning. He asked if she still had it. She did not. It had been in her pocket, along with her notebook, on the night of the attack. Both had vanished by the time the stretcher-bearers carried her out of the building. Belle asked her to describe the cane she remembered. She closed her eyes and reconstructed the image that had been returning to her, night after night in dreams that left her sheets damp with sweat. The cane had been dark wood, polished to a high shine, with a curved handle and a metal tip at the base. The tip had made a distinctive sound against the floorboards, a sharp, metallic click that had echoed in the empty building, and she remembered something else now, something she had not recalled before. The sound of the cane was accompanied by a slight irregularity in the rhythm of the footsteps, a hesitation on the left side, as though the person using it favored that leg. Horace Tilling had walked with a cane for as long as anyone in Charlottesville could remember. He had injured his left leg in a riding accident 20 years earlier, an injury that had left him with a permanent limp and a reliance on a walking stick with a brass tip. He was 57 years old in 1874, a banker of considerable local influence, a deacon at the First Presbyterian Church, and one of the principal investors in the consortium that had purchased the disputed properties from the county. His name appeared on 9 of the recovered deeds. He had sat on the board that approved Silas Pembroke's appointment as county notary. And he had been, according to courthouse gossip, one of the last people to visit the records office on the afternoon before Abigail was attacked. Bell wanted to publish the findings immediately. He had gathered enough evidence, he argued, to at least raise questions that the sheriff could no longer ignore. The list of names, the forged letters, the consistent handwriting, the financial connections, it all pointed to a systematic fraud that had stripped dozens of families of their land. But Abigail refused. She wanted to confront Horace Tilling first, to see his face when she presented him with the evidence, and to hear from his own lips an explanation. She was not interested in justice, or at least not only in justice. She wanted to understand how a man like Tilling, respected, wealthy, pious, could have participated in something so methodically cruel. She wanted to know, she told Bell, whether there was any part of him that felt the weight of what he had done. The meeting took place on the afternoon of December 16th in Tilling's private office at the Albemarle Savings and Trust. The building stood on the corner of Main and 3rd Streets, a 2-story brick structure with tall windows and a brass plaque beside the door that read, "Established 1847. Inside, the floors were dark oak, the walls lined with ledgers and framed certificates, the air thick with the smell of leather and ink and the faint sweetness of pipe tobacco. Tilling received Abigail in a high-backed leather chair behind a desk that was almost absurdly large for the modest dimensions of the room. His cane, dark wood, curved handle, brass tip, rested against the arm of the chair. She did not waste time on pleasantries. She laid out the graphite tracings, the newspaper notices, the letters with their identical errors, and the list of properties that had been transferred to Tilling's consortium for sums far below their assessed values. She spoke in a voice that was calm and steady, the voice of a woman who had spent 6 years reading legal documents aloud to clerks and judges. She told him what she knew. She told him what she had pieced together. And then she asked him, directly, whether he had been the one who struck her on the night of October 18th. Tilling listened without interruption. When Abigail finished speaking, he sat motionless for a long moment, his hands folded on the desk before him. Then he leaned back in his chair, exhaled slowly and smiled. It was not a smile of triumph or contempt. It was something closer to relief, the expression of a man who had been carrying a weight for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to set it down. The attack, he told her, had not been his idea. He had argued against it when it was first proposed, but he had not stopped it either, and that, he acknowledged, made him complicit. The scheme, he explained, had begun almost by accident in the chaotic months following the war, when the county's records were in disarray and no one was entirely certain who owned what. Pembroke, as the newly appointed notary, had been tasked with reconstructing the property ledger from a mass of scattered documents. He had discovered that many of the wartime confiscations had been conducted with such procedural irregularity that the transfers might be challenged in court, and that the original owners, those who were still alive, could potentially reclaim their land. Rather than expose the errors and risk unraveling years of transactions, Pembroke had proposed a simpler solution. He would create a new set of records, one that reflected the current distribution of properties and eliminated any inconvenient claims. The men who had disappeared from the ledger had, in Pembroke's version of events, either died during the war, relocated voluntarily, or been declared legally incapacitated. The documentation to support these fates had been produced by Pembroke himself, using his access to county seals, his skill with a pen, and the collaboration of a network of local officials who had profited directly from the redistribution of land. Tilling had been brought into the arrangement by Nathan Crowe, the sheriff, who had approached him in the summer of 1865 with a proposition. Crowe had identified several properties whose owners were dead, missing, or unlikely to return. If Tilling would provide the capital to purchase these properties at auction, Crowe would ensure that the auctions were conducted quietly and that no competing bids were registered. The profits would be divided among the participants. Tilling had agreed, and over the following 2 years, he had acquired an interest in 14 separate parcels, most of them purchased for less than a quarter of their true value. The problem, Tilling continued, had arisen when some of the original owners began to return. Men who had been presumed dead after the war, or who had been reported missing by their families, had reappeared in Albemarle County and demanded the return of their property. They had legal claims, or they believed they did. They had deeds, or copies of deeds, or witnesses who could testify to their ownership. They had gone to the courthouse to file complaints. Some of them had gone to Pembroke directly. Pembroke had handled each case differently. Some of the returning owners had been paid to leave, offered small sums of money in exchange for signing away their claims. Others had been threatened, visited at night by men who made it clear that pursuing the matter would be dangerous. A few had been examined by Dr. Amos Whitley, a physician with ties to the local courts, who had conveniently diagnosed them with mental infirmities that justified their removal to state institutions, and some, Tilling admitted, had simply disappeared. He claimed not to know the details of these disappearances. He claimed that Pembroke handled those matters personally, and that he, Tilling, had never asked questions. The attack on Abigail, Tilling said, had been motivated by fear. She had come too close to the truth. Her cross-referencing of the property records had uncovered discrepancies that Pembroke could not explain. If she had continued her work, she would eventually have reconstructed the entire list of fraudulent transfers. She would have identified the properties, the purchasers, and the fates of the original owners. She would have exposed a conspiracy that reached from the courthouse to the bank to the sheriff's office. Pembroke had decided that she needed to be stopped, and Crowe had agreed. But it was not Pembroke who had struck her, Tilling said. It was Crowe. The sheriff had been waiting in the registry room when Abigail arrived on the night of October 18th. He had closed the door behind her, bolted it from the inside, and struck her before she could cry out. He had then torn the pages from the ledger, broken the window to create the appearance of an intruder's escape, and left through a side door that he locked behind him. The cane that Abigail remembered, the 3 sharp taps against the floor, had not been Tilling's at all. It had been Crowe's. The sheriff, it turned out, had suffered a minor injury to his left knee during the war, an injury that flared up in cold weather and sometimes required him to use a walking stick. He did not advertise this fact. He preferred to present himself as a vigorous and unencumbered man. But on the night of the attack, the weather had been damp and his knee had been troubling him. He had brought the cane. Abigail received this information in silence. She did not weep. She did not raise her voice. She simply sat in the chair across from Horace Tilling and absorbed the full weight of what he was telling her. When she finally spoke, her question was not about the conspiracy or the money or even the attack itself. She asked about the missing men. She asked whether any of them were still alive. Tilling hesitated. He looked toward the window, where the December light was already fading into the grey of an early winter evening. He said that he did not know. He said that Pembroke had been the one who arranged the letters and the medical reports. He said that he had never seen a body. And then he said something that Abigail would remember for the rest of her life, that the worst thing a man could do was not to kill, but to erase, to remove a person from the record so completely that it was as though they had never existed at all. The meeting ended shortly after dark. Tilling promised to provide a written statement detailing everything he had told her. He promised to cooperate with any investigation that might follow. He asked for 3 days to put his affairs in order. Abigail agreed. She walked home through the empty streets, her breath clouding in the cold air. And when she reached her room, she sat at her table and began to write down everything she could remember of the conversation. 2 days later, on the morning of December 18th, Horace Tilling was found dead in his office. His body was discovered by a clerk who had arrived early to stoke the fire. Tilling was slumped over his desk, his left hand still clutching a pen, a half-written letter spread before him. Dr. Greeley, summoned to the scene, attributed the death to a sudden failure of the heart, noting that Tilling had a history of cardiac complaints and that the stress of his professional responsibilities might have contributed to the episode. No autopsy was performed. The body was released to the family for burial. Sheriff Crowe arrived at the bank within the hour. He examined the scene, spoke briefly with the clerk, and collected the letter from Tilling's desk. When he emerged from the office, he informed the gathered onlookers that the letter appeared to be a personal confession of some sort, although he declined to share its contents. He stated that the document would be filed with the county as part of the routine paperwork associated with an unattended death. He expressed regret at the passing of a respected citizen and banker, and then he returned to his office, where he remained for the rest of the day. Elias Bell heard the news from a customer who stopped by the print shop that afternoon. He closed the shop early, walked to Abigail's lodging and told her what had happened. She received the information without visible emotion. She had been expecting something like this, she told him quietly. She should not have given Tilling 3 days. Bell was not willing to let the matter rest. He had spent too many nights hunched over the graphite tracings, too many hours squinting at microfilm newspaper pages to accept that the death of a single banker would close the case. He insisted on seeing the confession that Tilling had been writing at the time of his death. Through a contact in the county clerk's office, a young man who owed him a favor for some printing work, he obtained a copy of the document the following afternoon. The letter was written in a hand that Bell recognized immediately. It was the same hand that had produced the forged letters from the missing men, the same hand that had spelled received as received, the same hand that had created the false medical reports and the fabricated travel notices. It was not Horace Tilling's hand at all. It was Silas Pembroke's. Someone, in the hours between Tilling's death and the discovery of his body, had entered the office, removed whatever document Tilling had actually been writing, and replaced it with a forged confession that exonerated everyone except the dead man. The letter claimed that Tilling had acted alone, that he had manipulated the property records for his own enrichment, and that he had ordered the attack on Abigail Whitmore to prevent her from uncovering his crimes. The letter made no mention of Pembroke, or Crowe, or Dr. Whitley, or any of the other participants in the scheme. It was a perfect piece of legal theater, a confession that blamed a dead man for everything and left the living free to continue their work. Bell wanted to publish the full story. He had the graphite tracings, the newspaper notices, the forged letters, and now the falsified confession. He had enough material to fill a dozen issues of his paper, but Abigail urged caution. The conspiracy they were facing was not merely criminal, it was institutional. It involved the sheriff's office, the county notary, the medical examiner, and the courts. If they published prematurely, the evidence would be discredited, the witnesses would be silenced, and they themselves would be at risk. She suggested instead that they compile a comprehensive report and deliver it to the State Attorney General's office in Richmond, where the local network of influence might be less effective. They spent the Christmas season of 1874 assembling the report. Bell wrote the text, setting it in type himself on his press, while Abigail organized the documentary evidence into a series of numbered exhibits. The report detailed the fraudulent property transfers, the forged letters, the false medical reports, and the attack on Abigail. It named Pembroke, Crowe, and Whitley as the principal conspirators, and it listed 17 other individuals, merchants, landowners, and minor officials, who had profited from the scheme. It included the testimony that Tilling had given to Abigail before his death, reconstructed from her notes. And it included a complete list of the missing men, 31 names in all, along with the properties that had been stolen from them and the fates that the forged documents attributed to them. The finished report ran to 67 pages. Bell printed 3 copies, one for the Attorney General, one for their own records, and one that he sealed in an envelope and placed in a safety deposit box at a bank in Richmond, with instructions that it should be opened in the event of his death or disappearance. He and Abigail traveled together to deliver the first copy, taking the morning train from Charlottesville on January 4th, 1875. The Attorney General's office accepted the documents and promised to review them. No immediate action was taken. Weeks passed without word from Richmond. February came and went. March brought warmer weather, but no progress on the investigation. Bell continued to publish his newspaper, though he noticed a decline in advertising revenue that he suspected was not coincidental. Several long-time advertisers had quietly withdrawn their business, and the editor of a rival paper had published a brief notice questioning Bell's journalistic integrity and suggesting that his recent association with Abigail Whitmore was improper for a married man. Bell was not married, and the implication was clearly intended to discredit both of them. He ignored it and continued his work. Abigail returned to her copying duties at the courthouse, although the atmosphere there had changed. Pembroke no longer spoke to her directly, communicating instead through written notes left on her desk. The other clerks avoided her, and she noticed that certain files she requested were suddenly unavailable, having been misplaced or removed for administrative review. She understood the message. She was being tolerated, but only barely, and only as long as she remained silent. The pressure intensified in the spring. On the night of April 9th, the windows of Bell's print shop were broken by rocks thrown from the street. No one was injured, but the damage was extensive, and Bell was forced to suspend publication for 2 weeks while repairs were made. The sheriff's office declined to investigate, citing a lack of witnesses. 2 days later, Abigail returned to her lodging to find that the lock on her door had been forced and her room searched. Nothing of value had been taken, but the graphite tracings and her personal notes had been removed. The blank envelopes, however, were still there, stacked neatly in the drawer of her nightstand, as though whoever had searched the room wanted her to know that he had seen them and chosen not to take them. It was around this time that Abigail began to notice a man standing across the street from her lodging in the evenings. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in a dark coat, and he never approached her or spoke. He simply stood there, watching, from the time she arrived home until the time she extinguished her lamp. She mentioned him to Bell, who offered to walk her home each evening, but she declined. She did not want to involve him any further than he already was. She had begun to understand, with a clarity that was almost peaceful, that the conspiracy they were fighting was not something that could be defeated by exposure alone. It was a structure, a network of interests and obligations and shared secrets that had woven itself into the fabric of the community over nearly a decade. To pull on a single thread was to risk unraveling the entire cloth, and there were too many people with too much to lose for that to be permitted. The response from the Attorney General's office finally arrived in May, delivered not by mail, but by a clerk who travelled from Richmond specifically to meet with Abigail and Belle at the print shop. The clerk, a young man named Wendell Hodge, explained that while the Attorney General found the report compelling, his office lacked the authority to pursue criminal charges without original documentary evidence. The copies that Belle and Abigail had submitted, while persuasive, were not admissible in court. The original ledgers, the forged letters, and the medical reports would need to be produced, but those originals were stored in the Albemarle County Courthouse, under the supervision of Silas Pembroke, and Pembroke, when contacted by the Attorney General's investigators, had informed them that the requested documents had been lost in a routine reorganization of the archives. He had been cooperative. He had expressed regret, but he could not produce what no longer existed. Belle received this news with a silence that was more expressive than any outburst could have been. He had anticipated this outcome. He had known from the beginning that the very people they were accusing were the people who controlled the evidence. What he had not anticipated was the fire. It broke out on the night of May 22nd, 1875. The Albemarle County Courthouse, a two-story brick building that had stood since 1838, caught fire sometime after midnight. By the time the volunteer fire brigade arrived, the flames had consumed the second floor and were spreading through the ground floor offices. The records room, where the property ledgers and deed books were stored, was directly above the furnace room, and the fire had apparently started there, feeding on the dry paper and old wood with a ferocity that made rescue impossible. The fire burned until dawn. By the time it was extinguished, the records room had been reduced to a shell of blackened brick and ash. The ledgers, the deed books, the loose filings, the correspondence, everything that might have proved the fraudulent transfers, was gone. The fire marshal's report attributed the blaze to a faulty flue in the furnace. The investigation was conducted by Sheriff Crow's office. No evidence of arson was found. In the weeks that followed, Silas Pembroke announced that the stress of the fire and the disruption to county business had convinced him to retire from his position. He submitted his resignation to the county commissioners, effective at the end of June, and began making arrangements to leave Virginia. He had accepted a position, he told acquaintances, with a land company in Nebraska that needed an experienced notary to handle its property transactions. He left Charlottesville on the morning of June 28th, traveling alone, and was not seen in Albemarle County again. Sheriff Crow remained in office. The fire, he explained to the local newspaper, was a tragedy, but it was also a reminder of the need for vigilance in the protection of public records. He pledged to oversee the reconstruction of the courthouse and the restoration of the county's documentary heritage. No one challenged him publicly. The advertisers who had abandoned Belle's paper continued to place their notices with the rival publications, and Belle's finances grew increasingly precarious. By the autumn of 1875, he was forced to reduce the frequency of his paper from weekly to monthly. By the following spring, he had ceased publication entirely and found work as a typesetter for a printer in Richmond. He did not, however, abandon the story. In November of 1875, he published a modest pamphlet titled A Record of Irregularities in the Albemarle County Land Office, 1865-1867, which he printed at his own expense and distributed to libraries, newspaper editors, and legal societies throughout the state. The pamphlet did not name names. It did not make accusations. It simply presented, in the dry language of documentary analysis, the evidence that he and Abigail had gathered, the graphite tracings, the newspaper notices, the forged letters, the statistical anomalies in the property records. It was a careful, lawyerly document, and it attracted almost no attention. A few newspapers mentioned it in passing. A law journal in Richmond published a brief summary. Then the pamphlet was forgotten, filed away on shelves where no one would read it and no one would remember it. Abigail Whitmore did not return to the records office after the fire. She did not seek other employment at the courthouse, nor did she pursue any legal action against Pembroke or Crowe or any of the other men whose names had appeared in the report. She moved to a smaller room on the eastern edge of town, near the train depot, and supported herself by taking in sewing and occasional transcription work for private clients. She lived quietly, spoke little of the past, and received few visitors. Bell continued to write to her, and she occasionally replied, but their letters grew shorter and more infrequent as the years passed. The last known correspondence between them was dated 1881. She never married. She never spoke publicly about the events of 1874. When acquaintances asked about the scar above her right eyebrow, she told them she had fallen. When they asked about the attack at the records office, a story that had become, over time, a morbid piece of local folklore, she changed the subject. She died on the morning of March 17, 1891, at the age of 49. The cause of death was recorded as pneumonia, though the physician who attended her noted that she had been in declining health for some time and that her constitution appeared to have been weakened by years of chronic nervous strain. She was buried in the small cemetery behind the Presbyterian church, in a plot she had purchased for herself 15 years earlier. The funeral was attended by fewer than a dozen people. Elias Bell, who had travelled from Richmond upon hearing the news, was among them. It was Bell who discovered the envelopes. He had volunteered to sort through Abigail's personal effects, a task that no one else seemed eager to undertake, and had spent the better part of a day in her small rented room, going through the modest collection of belongings she had left behind. In a wooden chest at the foot of her bed, beneath a stack of mended linens and a box of sewing supplies, he found a leather portfolio tied with a frayed ribbon. Inside the portfolio were 27 numbered envelopes. Each envelope contained a set of documents relating to a single property that had been fraudulently transferred during the years after the war. Some envelopes held graphite tracings, the same ones that Bell had helped to develop in the weeks after the attack. Others held handwritten copies of deeds, reconstructed from memory or from fragmentary records. Still others contained newspaper clippings, correspondence, and notations in Abigail's small, precise hand. Each envelope was labeled with the name of the original owner whose land had been stolen, and the name of the person or persons who had received it through the fraudulent transfer. Together, the 27 envelopes represented a complete reconstruction of the conspiracy. 31 men erased from the record, 17 collaborators named, and a chain of evidence that connected the crime to the highest levels of local government. Abigail had never stopped working. She had spent the 17 years since the fire quietly, methodically, and in complete isolation, compiling the case that the state had refused to pursue. She had done it without access to the original records, without the protection of any institution, and without any reasonable hope that her work would lead to justice. She had done it because it was the only response she could make to the forces that had tried to erase not only the men who had owned the land, but the very fact that they had ever existed. The 27th envelope was different from the others. It was unlabeled, and when Bell opened it, he found it contained only a single sheet of paper. The paper was blank, but at the bottom of the sheet near the edge there were 3 small circular indentations, spaced evenly apart. The indentations were the diameter of a brass-tipped cane. They had been pressed into the paper with enough force to leave permanent marks. Bell stared at the marks for a long time. He knew, as Abigail must have known, that the blank page with its 3 impressions carried a meaning that did not need to be written down. It was a signature of sorts, a calling card left by someone who had entered her room at some point during those 17 years, had looked through her work, and had chosen not to destroy it. The marks said what the voice had said on the night of the attack, what the blank envelopes had said month after month: forget the names you have read. And if you cannot forget them, at least know that someone is watching to make sure you never speak them aloud. Bell placed the envelope back in the portfolio, tied the ribbon, and closed the chest. He did not mention the envelopes to anyone at the funeral. He did not write about them in the brief obituary he published for Abigail in a Richmond paper. He simply took the portfolio with him when he left Charlottesville that evening, carried it back to his small apartment in Richmond, and placed it in a drawer that he rarely opened. The portfolio remained there for the remaining 12 years of his life. He sometimes thought about publishing its contents, about completing the work that Abigail had begun, but he understood that the moment for such an exposure had long since passed. The men named in the envelopes were mostly dead by then. Pembroke had died in Nebraska in 1887, struck by a runaway wagon outside a land office. Crowe had retired from the sheriff's office in 1878 and succumbed to a stroke 3 years later. Dr. Whitley had moved to Philadelphia, where he had died in his bed, surrounded by family. The missing men whose names filled the envelopes were beyond the reach of any restitution. Their families had scattered. Their land had been sold and resold, and the records that might have proved their claims had been reduced to ash on the night of the fire. What remained was the silence. It had been maintained for 17 years by Abigail Whitmore, who had carried the names inside her, guarding them like a flame in a windstorm. When she died, the silence passed to Bell, and when Bell died, it passed to no one. The portfolio was never published. It was not among the belongings catalogued after Bell's death in 1903, and its whereabouts after that date are unknown. Some researchers of Virginia land disputes have suggested that it was destroyed along with other personal papers by Bell's landlady, who considered old documents a fire hazard. Others believe it was acquired by a private collector and remains, unexamined, in some archive or attic. The official records of Albemarle County, reconstituted after the fire, contain no reference to any of the 31 men whose names appeared in Abigail's envelopes. The land itself, of course, remains. The parcels that were stolen during those chaotic years after the war have changed hands many times since then, passing through generations of buyers and sellers who had no knowledge of what had occurred. The farms have been subdivided, the boundaries redrawn, the old survey lines buried under roads and housing developments and shopping centers. If you were to stand on one of those parcels today, you would see nothing unusual. There would be no marker, no plaque, no trace of the men who had once cleared those fields and built those fences and believed that the land they worked belonged to them. The erasure is complete. But in the county archives, if you know where to look, you can still find traces, not of the crime itself, but of the silence that surrounded it. In the minutes of the County Commission for 1875, there is a brief entry noting the fire that destroyed the records room and the resignation, shortly thereafter, of the county notary. In the newspaper archives, there are a handful of articles, easily overlooked among the wedding announcements and the crop reports, that mention the strange case of the attack on Abigail Whitmore, the missing ledger pages, and the sheriff's determination that no crime had occurred. And in the death records for the years between 1865 and 1867, there are names that appear too neatly, in clusters that suggest not the random hand of fate, but the careful arrangement of a pen. Those names are the last testament of the men who were erased. They are not names that anyone remembers. They are not names that appear in history books or on monuments. They are simply marks on paper, easily ignored, easily forgotten, but they are still there. And as long as they are there, the silence that Abigail Whitmore carried for 17 years is not yet complete. It is waiting, perhaps, for someone else to find the envelopes, to read the names, and to understand that the most terrible things are not the ones that are hidden, but the ones that are hidden in plain sight. The 27th envelope, with its blank page and its 3 circular marks, remains the most unsettling piece of the archive. Was it left by Sheriff Crow as a final gesture of intimidation, a reminder that the silence was still being enforced? Or was it left by someone else entirely, someone who had inherited the secret and wanted to ensure that it was never forgotten? There is no way to know. The marks offer no clue beyond their own existence. They are simply there, 3 small indentations in a sheet of paper that was never meant to bear a message. Abigail kept the envelope. She did not destroy it, as many people in her position might have done, to remove the reminder of what had been done to her. She did not include it in the package she sent to the Attorney General as evidence of continued harassment. She kept it in the chest at the foot of her bed, among the linens and the sewing supplies, as though it were an ordinary household object, a receipt or a letter from a friend. Perhaps she kept it as proof that the conspiracy was real, that the men who had tried to erase her memory had failed. Or perhaps she kept it as a warning to herself, a reminder that the silence could be broken at any moment if she chose to speak. The most likely explanation, and the one that Elias Bell came to accept in his later years, is that Abigail kept the envelope because she understood something that the conspirators did not. That silence can be a weapon, but it can also be a record. By refusing to speak, by refusing to publish, by refusing to pursue the case through channels that had already been corrupted, she had preserved the evidence in a form that no one could challenge or destroy. The names in the envelopes were not allegations, they were not accusations, they were simply facts, written down by a woman who had devoted her life to copying facts, and they would remain facts whether anyone chose to read them or not. The 27 envelopes in the leather portfolio were, in a sense, the completed ledger that had been torn apart on the night of October 18th, 1874. The pages that Crow had ripped from the binding had been recreated one by one in Abigail's careful script. The names that Pembroke had tried to erase had been preserved, not in the county records, but in a private archive that owed nothing to any institution, and the blank page with its 3 circular marks was, in its way, the most complete entry of all. It recorded not a name or a property or a date, but the thing that had driven the entire conspiracy, the fear that someone, someday, would remember. That fear was justified. Abigail remembered. She remembered the names of 31 men who had been erased from the public record. She remembered the sound of a cane striking the floor 3 times in a darkened room. She remembered the voice telling her to forget, and she chose instead to remember. To write it all down, to seal it in envelopes and to store it in a chest where it would wait, in silence, for someone to open it and understand. The story of Abigail Whitmore does not end with a trial or a conviction or a public vindication. It ends, as most true stories do, in a rented room filled with papers that no one will ever read. But the papers exist. The names are written down. The silence has been broken, even if no one has heard it yet, and that perhaps is the only justice that a story like this can ever have.